Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Tea Time with the Robert H. Jackson Center. Thank you so much for being here. Today, I am chatting with Professor William Casto. He is a Texas Tech faculty since 1983, after practicing law for a number of years. He has written a number of well-received books and articles on international tort law and on the federal courts. The United States Supreme Court, in fact, has cited or relied upon his published scholarship. He is a member of the American Law Institute, and he holds a Paul Whitfield Horn Professorship, which is the highest honor that Texas Tech can bestow on a faculty member. Professor Casto, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. I think I want us to have some fun this afternoon. We're all cooped up in our houses. We're bored out of our mind. We've seen everything on Netflix. So this will be something different, I hope.
Absolutely. Well, and we're all about the tea time casual conversation here. So this is great. I think it probably makes sense for our audience if we start with two basic questions. So let's start with having you describe the role of the Attorney General in the President's cabinet.
Well, the Attorney General is the President's primary legal advisor and is responsible for enforcing the laws of the United States at the President's bidding. The Attorney General advises the President, although today they have farmed a lot of that out to one branch of the Department of Justice called Office of Legal Counsel. In Robert Jackson's time, there was no OLC, and he was a very important legal advisor to the President. And attorneys general, like other cabinet officers, try to further the president's policies.
Makes sense. And so when you and I were chatting to set this up, one of the conversations we had, or one of the ground rules we thought it was important to establish, is that as a threshold matter, we all try very hard not to break the law. And that includes presidents and attorneys general. I have to get that plural correct. But sometimes you need to take a look at the circumstances and make a decision.
That's right. As you say, ordinarily, you comply with the law. Someone tells you you can't do that, it's illegal, you don't do it. By the way, President Roosevelt, that was his position also. He complied with the law even when he didn't like it. Except that sometimes we break laws, right? By the way, there's a strong history in Western thought that respected leaders, if the problem is serious enough, are quite willing to act lawlessly. So to say that President Roosevelt was lawless is not to say that he was an evil person. By the way, Abraham Lincoln acted lawlessly, he said. He said he acted lawlessly in order to preserve the Union. Winston Churchill has written, yeah, I violated international law. It was important to preserve my country. Thomas Jefferson, in the 18 teens, said that, you know what, if I had a chance to buy Western Florida, I would be willing to do that on my own, even though Congress has to approve it, has to appropriate the funds. But I think that would be too good a deal to pass up. And I would realize I'm violating the law, but I would do it, okay? Roosevelt did the same thing. By the way, when we're talking about the Attorney General, we have to do a very clear distinction, make a very clear distinction between advising what the law is. Robert Jackson always was a straight shooter with President Roosevelt. If Jackson thought something was illegal, he would tell the president that. By the way, he described his position as, I'd tell the president what his chances were, what his risk was. That is, hey, this is illegal, or it's not illegal. Then, having given that clear advice, the president would make his decision. Typically, the president would decide, well, we won't do it if it's illegally. But on 3 occasions that we'll talk about today, the president decided, I'm going to violate the law anyway. Now, Jackson said, once the president had made up his mind, then I would support the president as best I could. Mm-hmm. He was willing to support the president by facilitating illegal expenditures of funds. He was willing to support the president by facilitating the illegal sale of arms to Great Britain. And he was willing to support the president by administering a flagrantly illegal wiretap program. So I thought we might want to talk about those episodes today.
Yep, I think that sounds great. So, and just in terms of advising, I do think it's important for us to stress that one of the main benefits, one of the most powerful things that the Attorney General does is provide the president with the full picture of what the law is. So a he, and hopefully at some point eventually a she, will be able to make a decision with the full understanding of these are the laws that are applicable here. So I understand if I'm going to break them, what the possible consequences are, or what the rules actually are that I am breaking.
That's exactly the case. If the president is going to violate the law, the president should know so, If the president is contemplating something that probably is illegal, the president should know so. If an attorney general fails to give the president a full picture of what the law is on a subject, then essentially the attorney general is duping the president. Mm-hmm. Is tricking the president into taking actions that maybe the president would take them anyway, but at least the president should know when there's a legal problem. That's the problem. That's the concept of advice. That's very easy.
Absolutely. All right. So let's take a look at probably one of the easier decisions, or at least one of the questions that Jackson and President Roosevelt grappled with that did not have a whole lot of moral implications to it. And that is the creation of the national airport in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, that's kind of fun, mainly because I bet a lot of us have flown into that airport, right? Oh. And we decide, take a taxi or take the subway. Well, if I have an expense account, I'll take a taxi, Well, the national airport in 1938 didn't exist. Yep. It was, in Jackson's words, literally a farm pasture, and it had a road running through it. So when a plane was going to land at the national airport, they had to send flagmen out to stop the traffic. And after the plane had landed, then the flagmen would let the traffic continue. It was ridiculous, right?
It's pretty amazing to visualize, just having moved up to Jamestown from the DC area, knowing all of the roads and all of the buildings that are around National Airport, that's a little bit funny to imagine that at one point it was really a field with a road running through it.
So the president was, in Jackson's words, pretty much disgusted by this. They had been trying to build a national airport for over a decade, but it was all snarled up in Congress with real estate interests and that sort of thing. And so the president said, okay, I want to start construction on our national airport. The funds needed were in 2 federal agencies, but there's a very firm law in the United States that says no federal officer can spend a dime unless Congress has granted or authorized the expenditure of the dime. The problem was Congress had not authorized it. The money was there. So the president told Jackson, hey, I want you to get together with those agencies and in the president's words, knock their heads together until you knock the money out of them. And that's what Jackson did. And they commenced construction of the National Airport in flagrant violation of the law. Now, notice this. DC, if you're trying to decide whether to act illegally, the law can't tell you whether to violate it or not. It becomes a moral issue. And in Jackson's mind, like I said, first of all, he told the president it's illegal, okay? The president said, I don't care, we're doing it. And Jackson then tried to help the president as best I could. He knocked the money out of the agencies. Do you see as a moral issue, you have to violate the law would mean you had a national airport. Mm-hmm. If you complied with the law, you would not have a national airport. Yep. Well, that seemed very simple to the president. Notice also the law had almost no moral content in it. Yep. It wasn't going to hurt anyone. Jackson actually wrote that, you know what? We're not invading any private rights. We're not taking anyone's property. He saw it as a no harm, no foul situation. By the way, all of us in this little tea time this afternoon have made the same decision when we exceed the speed limit or do a rolling stop. Those are no harm, no foul situations. Most, at least many, think nothing of it. But we do check to see if there's a police officer.
Of course. And you need to know the rule before, and you need to know what the consequences are before you think about whether or not you're going to break it.
Notice this, though. It did seriously impinge upon Congress's power over the purse. Now, that was a problem. But Jackson, first of all, he knew it was going to be blatantly public. One would know it. If Congress had a problem with it, they could do something about it. Also, on top of everything else, there's an issue of loyalty. As a practical matter, you can't run a large organization without some sort of loyalty, okay? And Jackson viewed his president as his hero, his friend, and his leader. He was very loyal to the president. But again, the national airports concept, it presented no moral issues. It was clearly a technical violation of the law.
All right, so let's move on to something perhaps that has slightly greater moral implications. So we know, and we've had previous conversations, tea time conversations, where we have touched on the destroyers for bases, and Justice Jackson working to help President Roosevelt justify giving Great Britain I believe it was about 50 destroyers very early in the war, before the United States entered the war, while they were still a neutral party, and while the desire to remain neutral, at least in Congress, was very strong. So why don't we talk about that, since that has we're raising the bar on some of the moral issues.
Yeah, that increases the stakes a little. In the summer of 1940, the Nazis had taken over Europe, and Britain stood alone fighting against the Nazis. Britain desperately needed destroyers to defend against a cross-channel invasion, and also to defend the convoys between the United States and Great Britain. What took a year or so to build those destroyers. So the British, Winston Churchill, wanted to get some U.S. destroyers. And there was a lot of haggling back and forth, but eventually President Roosevelt decided, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and give these destroyers to the British in exchange for important base rights along the eastern seaboard and in the Caribbean that could be used to defend the Panama Canal, for example, So Roosevelt decided he's going to do it. But the problem was there was a little technical glitch in our laws. It's clear that the president is not authorized to sell federal property unless there's an act of Congress giving him that authority.
And in this particular instance, if I'm remembering correctly, there were actually a couple of amendments specifically taking away some of that authority because Congress was worried about him supporting the British.
Congress was worried about some. It wasn't so, although Irish Americans didn't want to support the British, by the way, most people didn't mind supporting the British, but they did not want to get back into a war. That's what they didn't want.
Yeah, that's a better way of characterizing it. I did not mean to focus on the British specifically, but yes.
And also notice, if we're going to be in danger of the Nazis and the Japanese attacking us, if we give 50 destroyers away, that'll be 50 destroyers that we have lost. And one of the issues was if we gave 50 destroyers away and the British still were taken, those destroyers would now be used against us, right? It was a very difficult political decision, and Roosevelt was very reluctant to help the British. And many members of Congress did not want to deplete the U.S. Navy as a matter of self-defense, not neutrality. And they're very difficult decisions. The president ultimately decided that I'm going to do it. Even though we don't have quite as clear documentation on this, but it's very clear that it was illegal, technically illegal, because there was no authority to sell destroyers to the British. And Congress had passed some statutes that very summer intended to restrict the president's right to sell destroyers to the British. So presumably, Jackson told the president, this will be illegal. The president decided to do it. By the way, again, do you see no private rights were involved? No private property was taken. It was, however, a rather flagrant violation of congressional control over the disposal of property. But maybe it wasn't that much of a violation because the president was a savvy politician. He consulted with members of both parties, and they all said, don't ask us to legislate on this issue. We will, A, I won't be able to vote for you on it. B, we'll be tied up for half a year. If you do it on your own, I won't object. That's what the senators were saying. Okay.
Interesting. Okay.
Do you see that doesn't provide a legal basis for selling the destroyers? But wow, if we're talking about an affront to Congress's authority, if Congress on the side is saying, it's okay, go ahead and do it, but don't ask us to approve it, that considerably diminishes the notion of the president abusing his power.
Absolutely.
Notice that this was a step on the road to a war in which about 500,000 Americans died, right? There were moral issues here. Jackson, when he explained why he did this, he said, look, the problem is that that if Britain went under, then the Nazis would control Europe. We would be in America. The Nazis would have the combined German, French, Italian, and British fleet. And then we'd have the Japanese fleet in the Pacific.
Mhm.
It was a real problem. He really hated war. By the way, he wasn't a typical New Deal liberal in that regard. New Deal liberals tend to be very muscular in approaches to national defense. But he just said we couldn't live with the Nazis in control of Europe. I think he made the right moral choice. It's a moral choice. He made the right moral choice, clearly, in my mind.
It becomes
He
a bit of a
acted on.
balancing issue then. So
Pardon?
it becomes a bit of a balancing issue then. So he is trying to, in this instance, project what will happen if we don't do this. And is that consequence better or worse than if we do make this deal with Great Britain?
Yeah. What are the consequences of following the law? Not helping Great Britain. What are the consequences of violating the law? Helping Great Britain. I think if you just look at the consequences, the answer is very clear.
Absolutely. Okay. So you touched on this a little bit, but I think we should maybe delve into it deeper. And that is the attorneys general and the presidents obviously are not operating in a vacuum. They are operating in a political environment. And that is going to potentially influence or impact their decision-making processes.
Absolutely. And I guess in administering the criminal laws in the Justice Department, that's an important part of the Attorney General's job. Also in Jackson's time, a very important part of the Attorney General's job was to give legal advice to the president. Mm-hmm. Jackson was always very clear, I'm not going to pull any punches. The president needs to know exactly what the law is, what his chances are, and what his risk is, okay? But the Attorney General is a political animal and pays attention to politics. I think on the issues we've been discussing today, they're presidential decisions. The president clearly factored in politics. The president decided Congress would not act up if I just built the national airport. Mm-hmm. That was a political judgment. He was right. On the destroyers to Britain, it was a political decision, and the president decided that after consulting with members of Congress, that Congress wouldn't really be that upset. By the way, it was an election year, and Wendell Willkie was running against Roosevelt that year. And he also, through third parties, consulted with Wendell Willkie on providing the British with destroyers. And Willkie said he was not opposed. In fact, Willkie liked the idea of helping the British out. Willkie was an internationalist. He was a pretty admirable person, by the way. Mm-hmm. So, but notice the president was making political decisions.
Well,
not Jackson.
Please continue.
Not Jackson. Yeah. And by the way, Jackson would routinely make all sorts of administrative decisions. He probably considered politics in that regard. But on important issues, he would defer to the president after the president had been thoroughly briefed. And apparently the president welcomed dissent, liked people to say that's wrong, we shouldn't do this. And the president would listen to him and he thought, and then would make his decision. Once his decision was made, if you didn't support the decision, you were a traitor.
Mhm. Yeah, I can understand that. Well, it's, I think how we hope that most major decisions are made, that you have the plan and you have perhaps people who are poking at that plan, whether they are designated devil's advocates or just
Mhm.
trying to bring forth what other people might think about it or might say about it, because either that will modify the plan or it will help strengthen the plan. So, but then
Mhm.
once a path is determined, you sort of need to, again, absent it being truly illegal or something along that line, the idea is you fall in line with it to move that forward, so you don't have multiple voices in the plan.
And the president believed in that. He was a my way or the highway guy.
Mm-hmm.
But before he made his decision, he really was welcoming pros and cons discussions.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. So, and then we started to touch on some of the decisions that Attorney General Jackson was making. And so we're going to step up in the moral ladder to wiretapping. And so in the mid 1930s, there was actually an act, the Communications Act of 1934, that made wiretapping illegal. That's not to say it didn't go on. There seem to be many instances of the FBI still wiretapping and some military wiretaps, and the predecessor to the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms units. And so it was something that was still being used. And Justice Jackson made the determination that wiretapping was going to stop for the Department of Justice. And that caused some challenges for him.
Yeah, it really caused him a lot of grief. The act pretty clearly outlawed government wiretapping, plus two Supreme Court cases in the late 30s held that the act means what it says. The government is not allowed to wiretap.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the president wanted to wiretap. He apparently, looking for Nazi and communist spies who were going to, at this time, the communists fully supported the Nazis in the war against Great Britain. And there was a lot of fear that in the labor movement, Nazis and communists would try to impede war production.
Mm-hmm.
So the president wanted to have wiretapping by the FBI. Jackson looked into the matter, and actually Jackson first looked into the matter and decided it's illegal, and he banned the FBI from wiretapping. Then J. Edgar Hoover started sneaking around and managed a very good, effective guerrilla campaign against Jackson.
Mm-hmm.
And so the president decided maybe we'll wiretap. Now notice, wiretapping is a law with a moral dimension. Jackson consciously saw it as a civil rights issue,
Mm-hmm.
Impinging, that's what he said, impinging upon our citizens' privacy. He explained that Roosevelt wasn't very big on civil rights. If he wanted to do something, he would do it. So apparently Jackson told the president, it's unlawful to do this. You shouldn't do this. And the president thought about it and said, no, I want to do it anyway. And by the way, Jackson didn't stand down. The decision was not made yet. And so he said, you know what? First, he tried to put it off. He tried to stall the president.
Okay.
That didn't work very well. Eventually, the president
that would not have a great chance of success.
Yeah, but by the way, that's a great solution to true moral dilemmas. Stall, put it off. Maybe it'll go away. Okay. Then Jackson said, look, if you want me to administer an illegal wiretapping program, I will do it. You have to direct me to do this to violate the law in writing. And eventually the president sent a memo to Jackson directing Jackson to implement this illegal wiretap program. Now, notice this. The law is not always very clear. And frequently you can cobble together arguments that that in theory kind of make sense. Like someone advised the president, hey, don't worry. As a matter of national security, the Constitution allows you to violate acts of Congress. Jackson said, no, it does not.
That would be a very interesting interpretation of the Constitution.
Yeah, although that's a rather common interpretation in the last few years. So here's the thing. Although arguments were available, Jackson simply didn't believe they were right. He said they weren't accurate. So he advised the president, this is unlawful. A year later, he wrote a memo again saying you can't wiretap even in national security cases. When he was on the Supreme Court a decade later, he again said wiretapping was illegal, okay? But he went ahead and did it. DC, he gave very good advice on the law. Then he implemented the program. Notice this. This was a moral law. This wasn't like who can spend money and can we sell U.S. property. It was a law designed to protect human privacy interests. Jackson went ahead and did it. So again, I'm not certain I understand how he could justify going ahead and administering this problem as a moral decision. I think he was flat wrong. Notice also, everyone in DC knew that Jackson had somehow was allowing it to happen. For the next 2 or 3 decades, the government routinely wiretapped people illegally. And when they were called up on it, J. Edgar Hoover or Jackson's successor as Attorney General or Eisenhower's Attorney General, they said, well, Jackson did it. It must be okay. So,
well, I think it presents an interesting question. So if the president makes a conscious decision to violate a law with moral implications, what recourse does the Attorney General have, as a member of his cabinet to not follow that decision?
He can refuse to implement it. Jackson wasn't willing to. Yes.
Or I suppose he could resign, which I guess
he could resign. There's been studies. Very few people have resigned in the last century from high federal office as a matter of this is wrong, we're not going to do it. Maybe 5 or 6, It almost never happens for various reasons. Loyalty is one of the reasons, okay? Typically, when people have resigned, they've resigned and, they say, we've all heard this, right? I want to be more with my family, right? Jackson didn't resign. He never considered resigning. He could have resigned under protest. By the way, it's kind of interesting that in the last 3 years, some officials have been willing to resign under protest, like our former Secretary of Defense, for example. That's rather unusual in our history. But we're talking about Roosevelt and Jackson. Uh, really, your only choice in that situation is to, as a practical matter, to refuse to comply or to resign.
Mhm.
Uh, and as a practical matter, do you see when you take a job serving a president, you're making your bed.
Mhm.
You're saying that I think this person is a capable person and I want to serve this person.
Yes.
And again, Jackson he loved Roosevelt. Roosevelt was his hero, his friend, and his leader. So the loyalty concept really played heavily with Jackson. Also notice that Jackson also did his best to atone for his sin. For the rest of his attorney generalship, he tried his best to get Congress to pass a statute that would allow wiretapping with important restrictions.
Mhm.
And he suffered great grief. People were attacking him all the time. He wrote later, it was like I was walking down a road and people were shooting at me from both sides. But he tried his best. And again, maybe his notion was, well, just a little wiretapping now in the summer of 1940 might be okay, as long as we can get Congress to clean up the situation.
Mhm.
Not that way.
Well, and if we, at least the underpinnings of this seem somewhat similar to the idea of helping Great Britain with the destroyers for bases. So there is a national security concern. It is a different moral calculation, obviously, because privacy is involved or a personal right is involved versus property, government property, public property. But at least I feel as if J. Edgar Hoover took a smart tactic in trying to drum up the support he wanted in order for for the wiretapping to continue by pinning it to the national security concerns.
Oh, by the way, also, Jackson's very, very firm opposition to wiretapping also may very well have played into the president's ultimate decision, because when the president decided to wiretap, he said, look, we're going to try as much as possible only to wiretap foreign nationals
Hmm.
in situations where there's a clear national security interest.
Mm-hmm.
So the president, perhaps in response to Jackson's arguing, put some limitations in his written order to Jackson. Of course, J. Edgar Hoover administered the program. And by the way, technically what J. Edgar Hoover did was he had two books. This is true. You can't make this up. One book, he had all the wiretaps that he had checked with Jackson on. In the other book, he had a lot of wiretaps that he just did on his own and never told anyone.
Gotcha.
So we had wiretapping out the gazoo for the next 3 or 4 decades.
Mm-hmm. Yep. This also seems to play, and I wonder if we've had some conversations in the T chats about the steel seizure case
Uh-huh.
and Justice Jackson's three-prong approach to
Yes.
executive power. And I feel as if a lot of our conversation, this is probably some of his thinking on that. And so when he gets around to writing that opinion for the steel seizure case, it's pretty clear to him, okay, Congress has a law that says you can do this. That's the easy one. Congress either doesn't have a law or it's kind of
Uh-huh.
bogged down or a gray area. That's a second calculation. And then in the third calculation, when there seems to be a law expressly prohibiting you from doing it, that is
Uh-huh.
where the executive's power is the weakest.
That's right. Although in the steel seizure case, when the justices were having their private discussions, Jackson said, the president can throw the law overboard. We can't. By the way, he had seen President Roosevelt throw the law overboard in wiretapping National Airport and destroyers for bases, right? But he, as a judge on the Supreme Court, he was just going to decide what the law was. And by the way, in each of these cases, it's very clear that these were third category cases, very clearly third category cases, which says it's flat illegal. Okay. And also notice when he was Attorney General, he was serving his, hero, friend, and leader. Then he went on to become the chief prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials. And he saw how what the horrible abuse of executive power was. It changed his life aspect. He was emotionally different when he came back from Europe. He used to be a very friendly, easygoing guy. He had lost a lot of that through pouring through all that. We've all seen like bulldozers, bulldozing bodies and that kind of stuff. It's just horrible. So he was a lot more interested in separation of powers when he came home from Nuremberg. And also when he decided the steel seizure case, he really disliked President Truman. President Truman was not his hero, friend, and leader. President Truman aced him out of the Chief Justiceship, for example, of the Supreme Court. Yep. So yeah, but in steel seizure, he was talking about what judges do and how you analyze the law. In steel seizure, he specifically understood the president sometimes doesn't follow the law.
Yep, that's true. All right, we're going to open it up for questions. So we do have a couple who have asked questions already. So let me ask you those. So the first question is, I'm not sure how thorough of a study you have made about presidents breaking the law, but we have received a question from Phil asking, in your opinion, which president broke the law the most often?
You have to have, it's very easy to shoot from the hip on these issues. We might say our present president is an inveterate lawbreaker. I don't know if, I don't think we have enough information yet to see what's really going on inside, okay? Setting aside our President Trump, I gotta say Roosevelt seemed to break the law more than the other presidents who confessed that they broke the law.
Well, and I suppose you also have a greater scope of possibility over a 12-year span than you would.
That's true. That is true. Yeah.
Yes. Not surprisingly, we do have some questions about how you might compare the relationship between Robert H. Jackson and President Roosevelt with the relationship between Attorney General Barr and President Trump.
Here's the thing. When you agree, okay, let's talk about agreeing to serve at a very high level with the president, okay? There, of course, is a lot of careerism, right? Oh, this will look good on my resume, which I don't think that applies to, certainly not to Barr. There's also the concept of loyalty. And when we have looked at, well, there's the concept of loyalty, but notice that suggests that when you agree to serve a president at this high level, that means you're going to agree to abide by essentially the president's decisions. That means he's someone you respect and admire. But for careerism issues, why would you want to serve someone that you don't respect and admire? There is some notion that the attorney general can act as a restraint on some of the president's uh, uh, problems. Jackson clearly acted as a restraint on President Roosevelt. It's just he didn't have a veto power. Uh, uh, if you and by the way, I suppose a lot of people in the current administration have said they've stayed in office in order to impede the president's programs or restrain the president's programs. So that's a reason, I suppose. But wow, eventually you gotta decide, do I like what this person is doing? Mm-hmm. If you don't like what this person is doing, the kitchen just got too hot for you.
Understandable. Well, and I like what you said about Justice Jackson. I think one of his greatest roles for President Roosevelt, and I keep referring to him as Justice Jackson, but in this instance, Attorney General Jackson, is that he was a sounding board. They would have these very in-depth conversations and kick the tires on the various plans and ideas to see how they comported with the law, to ensure as much as possible that they followed the law, and develop a plan moving forward that was as law abiding as the consequences could allow.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And Jackson was at the very end of his attorney generalship. The issue of wiretapping arose again. But this time the Defense Department wanted to set up what they called a, quote, suicide squad in the FBI, whose job would be to burglarize office, steal materials, that sort of thing. And Jackson viewed it as the Defense Department trying to get at labor union leaders. Jackson was not naive, but he thought labor unions performed a very good service in our economy. So they wanted him to authorize the FBI to form this suicide squad, who would do what later became known as the black bag jobs, right? And Jackson said, no, there's no way I'll approve that. And then he wrote a 3-page letter to President Roosevelt outlining in detail exactly why this was a bad idea. It should not be done. So he was quite willing to vehemently disagree with the president. Notice in the suicide squad situation, we weren't talking about wiretaps, which the president had approved. Yes. We're talking about burglaries, okay? Yep. The president, in a very opaque, vague memo, approved the suicide squad and appointed Jackson to the Supreme Court at the same time. And the president said in a private conversation, one of the reasons he appointed Jackson to the Supreme Court was he didn't get along well with J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI. So I guess Jackson was no longer Attorney General then.
Yes, well, and in Robert Jackson's mind, hopefully that was the step he wanted to take. I remember reading that as much as he loved the Solicitor General role, he was not quite as fond of the Attorney General role.
He hated being Attorney General. He really did. He loved being Solicitor General, where he was a litigator in the Supreme Court. He loved that. he hated the politics. And he said, you can't do anything. If you try to read a page, within 3 minutes, someone will be telephoning you. This is what he said.
Mhm.
And by the etiquette of Washington, you have to put everything down and answer the phone and discuss whatever the little problem was. He hated being Attorney General. But
Right,
he said, when he mentioned in a letter to a friend that I can't resign. I owe the president my allegiance.
Interesting. So, and this leads into a question we just received as well. So, Attorney General Richardson, Nixon's
Yep.
Attorney General, resigned rather than
Right.
carry out the order to fire the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox. So, how might you contrast that or compare that to the dilemma that Justice Jackson, Attorney General Jackson, faced in the wiretap matter?
Well, it's a moral decision. It's simply a moral decision. Jackson decided that he could go along with the wiretapping, although part of his decision was, I'm going to get Congress to enact legislation to okay all this. That is, allow wiretapping with very stringent restrictions. So that made it a little easier for him, that this process of atonement enabled him to reconcile himself with the illegal misconduct. And again, another way to look at it is that Richardson did the right thing and Jackson did not, and I think Jackson should be morally condemned. I've forgotten, did I say what a great ethical thinker? One
You
of
have
our greatest
not
ethical
said
thinkers said that, let he who is without stone cast the first, he who is without sin cast the first stone. Well, we got to be a little forgiving of our fellow citizens like Jackson, but he didn't do well. And on this occasion, he decided to assist in interfering with the lives of our private citizens, illegally interfering.
Okay. Well, Professor Casto, those are all of the questions that we have for today. I'd like to thank you very much for being here with us. And for those of you who have tuned in, next week we will be speaking with the Attorney General of the state of New Jersey, Gurbir Grewal, and we'll be talking about how the pandemic has or is changing the justice system and access to justice. So tune in next week for that. And Professor Casto, thank you so much again for being here with us.
Oh, I really enjoyed chatting with everyone today. I hope everyone has had a good afternoon where they don't have to watch Netflix.
Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.